my name is Cole Married, and I was 28 years old the afternoon my stepmother looked me dead in the eyes across my father's casket and told me I was owed exactly nothing. She said it the way you'd correct a waiter who'd brought the wrong dish. Quietly, efficiently, with the particular confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. She wore a black dress that looked like it had been bought for the occasion, not borrowed. She had brought her sister. She had also, I would later learn, brought a second will. What she had not brought, what she could not have known to bring, was a copy of the first one. The one my father had signed 14 months earlier in a room she had never been allowed to enter. The one that had been sitting in a fireproof box inside a law office downtown since the week after my father's diagnosis, waiting quietly for exactly this afternoon. I didn't say a word when she said it. I just looked at her over the white roses somebody had arranged around his photograph. And I thought about a Tuesday morning 3 years earlier, when my father had called me from a parking lot to tell me he was getting remarried. He had sounded apologetic in the way men sound when they know they are doing something they will eventually have to answer for. I told him I was happy for him. I meant it in the way you mean things when you love someone complicated. He was my father. He was also a man who had spent 30 years making choices he understood were imperfect, and who had, in the last 14 months of his life, tried very hard to make one that wasn't. I did not know about the choice the day of the funeral. I found out the way my father intended me to find out. Slowly, in a room with good lighting and a box of tissues, and a man named Gerald Oates, who had been my father's attorney for 11 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I always get ahead of myself when I tell this part. Let me go back to where it started, which is not the funeral at all, but a Tuesday afternoon when I was 9 years old and my father picked me up from school with the windows down and the radio on and an expression on his face like a man carrying something heavy he was about to set down in my lap. He told me my mother had decided she wanted to live in a different city. He told me I would live with him. He told me that things were going to be different, and that different wasn't the same as worse. I remember watching a gas station pass through the window and thinking that I believed him. I believed him because he was my father, and because I was 9, and because I had not yet learned that you can love someone completely and still have no idea what they are capable of choosing when they are lonely. What I know now, sitting on the other side of 20 years of working that out, is that my father was a man who did his best in installments. He was good for a year, and then he'd sleep. He was present for a season, and then the distance would come back, quiet and total as a fog. He was, in the vocabulary I now use without bitterness, a man who loved me more than he knew how to show, and who spent the second half of his life trying to build a bridge between those two facts before the time ran out. He met Sandra when I was 22, and I was in my second year of a graduate program in architectural history that I paid for myself, on a combination of scholarships, teaching stipends, and a weekend job at a firm that specialized in restoration work. I say I paid for it myself, not to make a point about money, but because it matters for understanding what happened later, which is that when the question of my father's estate came up, Sandra's version of events required me to be a certain kind of person. She needed me to be the ungrateful child, the one who had coasted on my father's money, the one who had never stood on my own 2 feet. That version of me did not hold up to documentation, but she didn't know that yet. And on the day of the funeral, she was still very much operating inside her own version of the story. Sandra Merritt, née Calloway, was 51 years old, 6 years younger than my father, and she had 3 things that impressed him immediately. She was organized in a way my father, who was brilliant and chronically scattered, found genuinely restful. She was confident in rooms that made other people nervous, and she had, in my father's words, a talent for making a house feel like somewhere you'd want to come home to. She redecorated the house he'd owned since before I was born within 8 months of moving in. She replaced his furniture, his curtains, the photographs on the walls. She kept 3 pictures of me, 1 from my college graduation, 2 from his last birthday. The rest went into a box in the garage that I found when we were clearing out after the service. 7 years of his life before her, arranged in a shoebox with a rubber band around it. She hadn't thrown them out, but she hadn't left them anywhere a person could accidentally see them either. I want to be fair about Sandra, because fairness matters to me professionally and personally, and because she was not a cartoon villain. She loved my father in the way she was capable of loving people, which was efficiently and on her own terms. She managed his medications without being asked, and took notes at his oncology appointments that were more detailed than anything the nurses produced. When he was too tired to eat, she made food he could tolerate and left it in portions he could reach from the couch. These things were real. These things were also, as I have come to understand, consistent with being a person who had a very clear sense of what she was managing and why. There is a difference between care and investment. Sometimes they look identical from the outside. You have to be inside the room for a long time before you can tell them apart. My father was diagnosed 14 months before he died. Pancreatic cancer, caught later than they'd have liked, managed better than the statistics had suggested to expect. He had 14 months instead of the 6 they'd given him at the outset, and in those 14 months, he made 3 phone calls I would not learn about until after the funeral. The first was to Gerald Oates. The second was to me, which I'll get to. The third was to a woman named Patricia Engel, a notary public who had an office on the 3rd floor of a building on Calloway Street, and who charged a reasonable flat rate for witnessing the signing of legal documents. She had been paid by check. She had kept the record. Gerald Oates had kept the copy. And Sandra, who had been told my father was attending a follow-up appointment the afternoon of the signing, had kept a very different version of events in her head. A version in which there was only one will, and she was the primary beneficiary of everything. There were, as it turned out, 2 wills. The first, signed 7 years earlier when my father and Sandra had been married for 6 months, named Sandra as primary beneficiary of the house, his accounts, his retirement fund, and the majority of his assets, with a small sum designated for me, a sum that had been described to me once, briefly, as a gesture, in my father's phrasing. I had said that was fine. I had meant it. I was not in my father's life for his money. I was there because he was my father, and because the fact that he was imperfect did not make him disposable to me, which is something I had decided when I was 9 years old, in a car with the windows down, and which I had not undecided since. The second will had been signed 14 months before his death, 3 weeks after the diagnosis, and it was different in ways that Sandra was about to learn, in a room with good lighting. But I am still at the funeral. I need to stay at the funeral a moment longer, because the funeral is where Sandra made the choice that undid everything. The service was held at a church my father had attended irregularly and loved genuinely. The kind of church that has good acoustics and a pastor who speaks about the deceased as though he had actually known him, which this pastor had. My father had done pro bono structural assessments for 3 of the church's renovation projects over the years. He was that kind of man. He gave things away quietly and then forgot he had given them. The pews were full. Sandra sat in the front row with her sister Marlene, who had driven up from the coast and who I had met twice, and who had on both occasions managed to make me feel like a guest at an event I had not been invited to. I sat 2 rows back, with my girlfriend Adeze and my father's oldest friend, a man named Doug Whitfield, who had known my father since they were 19, and who cried with the specific dignity of a person who has been saving it for a long time. After the graveside service, there was a gathering at the house. Sandra had hired caterers, which was correct and appropriate. She had also, subtly and efficiently, arranged the room so that the photographs on display were all from the last 7 years. This was not lost on Doug. It was not lost on me. But we were at a funeral, and there are things you do not say at funerals, which I have always believed is one of the reasons people who need to have difficult conversations wait until they find one to have them. The room gives them permission. The grief gives them cover. Sandra found me in the kitchen, where I had gone to get a glass of water and a moment away from the particular exhaustion of being the bereaved son in a room full of people who knew my father mostly through Sandra's version of him. She came in with the deliberateness of someone who had been waiting for me to be alone. She had a glass of white wine. She set it on the counter with a small, precise sound. She said she hoped I understood that the house would be staying in her name, and that she expected the process to be straightforward. She said she had spoken to a lawyer. She said she was sure I was aware that these things could become complicated if people made them complicated, and that she was hoping, for everyone's sake, that we could keep things simple. She said it the way you'd explain a situation to someone who might not fully grasp the implications of it. She was not unkind. That was the part that I think she felt good about later, that she had not been unkind. She had delivered what she believed to be difficult news with a reasonable amount of composure, and she expected, I think, that I would thank her for her clarity, and that would be the end of it. I said I appreciated her letting me know. She studied me for a moment. She had been expecting something different. Grief, maybe, or anger, or at least the particular stiffness of a person swallowing something bitter. What she was looking at instead was a person who had already spoken to Gerald Oates. What she was looking at was a person who had been given a phone call 14 months earlier by a man who was 3 weeks into a diagnosis, and who had said to me in the careful voice of someone who has made a decision and needs you to understand it clearly, I am going to try to make something right. I am going to need you to trust me and not say anything until it's time. And I had said, "Okay, Dad." And I had kept his confidence the way I had always tried to keep his confidence, imperfectly and completely, which is the only way I know how to do anything. She went back to her guests. I finished my water. And 2 days later, in an office on the 14th floor of a building downtown, a man named Gerald Oates sat across from me and Sandra and Marlene, who had insisted on being present, and opened a manila folder and cleared his throat once, briefly, and began to read. I need to tell you who Gerald Oates is, because he matters in a way that isn't just procedural. He was 63 years old and had been practicing estate law for 38 of those years. He had a way of speaking that was neither warm nor cold, but was instead precise in the way that surgical instruments are precise. Not cruel, just calibrated for exactly the thing it needed to do. He had a photograph on his desk of a yellow Labrador, and a shelf behind him full of books that looked read rather than displayed. He had been my father's attorney for 11 years, and had in those 11 years sat across from every variety of human difficulty that estate law produces, which is most of the varieties. He had seen people scream. He had seen people faint. He had once, he mentioned to me afterward without elaboration, had a client attempt to eat a document. He had the composure, therefore, of a man who understood that what was about to happen in any given room was not the most remarkable thing that had ever happened in a room he was sitting in. And this turned out to be the quality that made him extraordinary. Sandra had arranged herself in the chair to my left with the posture of a person attending a formality. She had brought a notepad. She had already spoken to her own attorney, a man named Bryce, whom she mentioned twice in the first 5 minutes by first name, with the familiarity of someone establishing that they had resources. Marlene sat beside her with the solidarity of a woman who had been brought as ballast. I sat with my hands on my knees and my folder unopened, and my knowledge of what was in Gerald's manila envelope sitting inside me like a quiet engine I had not turned on yet. Gerald Oates opened the folder. He said there were 2 documents he needed to present. He said the first was a will signed 7 years ago. He summarized its terms. Sandra nodded along in the way of someone confirming what they already know. Marlene wrote something on the notepad. I watched the window behind Gerald's head, where the city went on without any awareness of the room we were all sitting in. Then Gerald said that there was a second document. He said this the way you'd note that there was a second course coming, without drama, without apology. He said my father had executed a new will 14 months prior. He said the new will superseded the first. He said this was standard procedure, that my father had been of sound mind, that there was a notarized record of the signing, and that the document itself was straightforward. He said he would now read it. Sandra's notepad pen stopped moving. The new will was, in most respects, fair to Sandra. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters for understanding who my father was trying to be in those last 14 months. She retained the right to live in the house for the remainder of her life, or until she chose to leave it. She received the retirement accounts, which were substantial. She received his car, his personal effects, and the sum of money that, by any reasonable measure, represented a comfortable inheritance. What she did not receive was the workshop. My father had been a structural engineer by training and a craftsman by compulsion. For 20 years, he had rented a space on the east side of the city, 3,000 square feet of organized obsession, tools and materials and drawings and the kind of serious equipment that takes years to acquire and a lifetime to learn to use. The workshop was separate from the house. It was in his name. It had been in his name since before he met Sandra. It had been transferred 14 months ago into a trust with a single beneficiary, administered by Gerald Oates, to pass to me upon my father's death, along with the complete contents, including a collection of tools that I had grown up watching him use, and that were, in the assessment of a specialist, Gerald had engaged at my father's request, worth more than the furniture Sandra had picked out for the living room. He had also left me a letter. Gerald produced it from the folder in a plain sealed envelope with my name on it, in my father's handwriting, and slid it across the desk. I put my hand on it and did not open it. I would open it later, alone, in the parking garage, with the kind of privacy a person needs when they are about to receive something that was meant only for them. Sandra was looking at the trust document. Her pen had been set down on the notepad. Without her seeming to notice, she'd set it down. She was reading with the attention of a person searching for an error, a loophole, a misprint, something that would allow the document to mean something other than what it said. Marlene was very still beside her. The room had the quality of a room in which something has shifted without anyone moving. My father, Gerald explained for the record, had made this decision independently and of his own volition. He had first discussed it with Gerald over the phone. He had then visited the office in person, alone, on the afternoon Sandra had believed him to be at a follow-up appointment. He had been clear-headed, deliberate, and specific about his intentions. He had also asked Gerald to include in the trust documentation a brief statement of purpose, which Gerald now read aloud. I am leaving the workshop to my son Cole, because it is the place where I was most myself, and he is the person who understood that the earliest, and who I hope will make it into something I would have been proud of. I am not doing this to diminish what Sandra and I built together. I am doing this to make right something I let be wrong for too long. Gerald read it in the same measured tone in which he read everything. And then the room was very quiet. Sandra turned to me. I want to tell you about the expression on her face because I have thought about it many times since, and I want to be accurate. It was not the expression of a villain. It was the expression of a person who had built a version of events inside their head, who had lived in that version, who had decorated and furnished it, and arranged the photographs on its walls, and who was now sitting in a room in which someone had quietly, carefully, and without any cruelty, explained that the version was wrong. It was the expression of a woman who had arrived prepared to manage a formality and had found instead a reckoning. And there was in it, I will say, something that was not entirely unlike grief. She had loved him. I believe that. I believe the grief was real. I also believe that what she had understood herself to be inheriting included a certain story about me, about what I was owed and what I was worth, and what my father had decided about me. And that story had just been revised without her knowledge, in a room she had never been allowed to enter, by a man she had believed she understood. She said, looking at me, "He didn't tell me." I said, "No, I know." Marlene put a hand on Sandra's arm. Gerald opened his mouth to continue, and Sandra held up one finger, just one, the way you'd pause a record, and she took a breath. And to her genuine credit, she did not say the thing that I think she wanted to say, which was something about fairness or expectations or the 7 years she had given. She took the breath and she set it down and she said quietly to Gerald, "What are the next steps?" Gerald told her. He told her in the same exact voice he had told her everything else. And I sat with my hand on the envelope and looked at the photograph of the yellow dog on his desk and let the afternoon do what it was going to do. I have to tell you what was in the letter. Not all of it, because there are parts that belong only to me, in the way that certain things only belong to the person they were meant for. But there is one part that I think is the center of it, the thing that the whole night, in a sense, had been rotating around, even though it happened 14 months before any of us sat down in that room. My father wrote, "I know I gave you less than you deserved for a long time. I know I let the path of least resistance run right over you more than once. And I am not going to apologize in this letter, because I do not think an apology belongs on paper. I think it belongs said out loud in a room. And I said it to you the Tuesday I told you about the diagnosis. And I hope you heard it the way I meant it, which is that it is the truest thing I know how to say. What I can put in this letter is what I want you to do with the workshop. I want you to use it. I want you to make things in it that would have taken me 30 more years to get to. I want you to take the emerald vase on the center bench and the hand planes on the east wall and the lumber I've been aging since 2019 and make something that matters to you. That is my will in the truest sense of the word. What I am willing for you. What I want to happen when I can't see it anymore." He signed it. "Your father, who is proud of you in ways he got better at saying, too late." I sat in the parking garage for 40 minutes. Then I drove to the workshop, which Gerald had arranged for me to access that same afternoon, and I stood in the doorway for a long time, in the particular smell of sawdust and linseed oil and old iron, which is the smell of every good hour I had ever spent with my father. And I understood what he had been trying to build in those 14 months. Not just the trust, not just the document with the notary's seal. He had been trying to build a correction. A man who had spent 30 years letting convenience make his decisions had spent his last 14 months making one deliberately, with paperwork, with a lawyer, with a sealed envelope and a plan. I want to tell you about what happened with Sandra because the story didn't end in Gerald's office, and I think the ending matters. She called me 3 days later. Not her lawyer, her. She called from a number I recognized, and I answered, which I will admit surprised me slightly. She asked if she could come to the workshop. She said she would like to see it. She said she had never been inside it. I said yes. She came on a Saturday morning. She stood in the doorway in a coat she didn't take off and looked at the emerald vase and the hand planes on the east wall and the lumber aging in the corner. And she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "He loved this place." I said, "I know." She said, "He talked about you in here. When we first met, he used to talk about you in here. Like you were a project he was always in the middle of." I thought he meant it as a problem. I understand now he meant it as something he cared about. I didn't say anything. She said, "I shouldn't have said what I said at the funeral, the kitchen. That was wrong of me, and I knew it when I said it, and I said it anyway, because I was afraid. And when I'm afraid, I get ahead of myself." I said, "I knew that too." She left after about 20 minutes. She didn't try to relitigate the trust. She didn't bring a lawyer. She came alone on a Saturday, and she stood in the doorway of a place she had never been allowed to enter, and she paid it the respect of looking at it honestly. I am not going to tell you we became close after that, because we didn't. I'm going to tell you that she sent me a card on the 1-year anniversary with a photograph inside it, one I hadn't seen. My father standing in this doorway in his work clothes, with sawdust on his collar, and an expression on his face that I recognized immediately and have no word for except home. What I did with the workshop is that I kept it. I use it twice a week and on some Saturdays. I finished a commission last spring, a set of architectural models for a museum exhibition on mid-century residential design, built from the lumber my father had been aging since 2019. He was right about it. It was ready. Doug Whitfield came to the opening of that exhibition. He stood in front of one of the models for a long time, and then he turned to me and said, "Your father would have had strong opinions about the joinery on the third corner." I said, "I know." I could hear him the whole time I was building it. And Doug laughed the way he cried at the funeral, with the dignity of someone who has been saving it. I am not going to tell you that grief resolved into something clean, or that loss has a satisfying geometry. I am going to tell you what I learned in that room with Gerald Oates, and in the workshop, and in the parking garage with a letter in my lap. which is this. My father spent a long time letting the path of least resistance decide things for him. And then, at the end of his life, when the path of least resistance would have been to do nothing, he chose the harder thing. He hired a lawyer. He drove alone to an appointment. He sat down and told the truth about what he wanted, and he paid a woman named Patricia Engel on Callaway Street to put her name on it, so it would hold. He did not do it loudly. He did not do it in a way that caused a scene or punished anyone, or made himself the hero of a story. He did it the way he did most of the things he did right. Quietly, with paperwork, in a room nobody knew he was in. And it held. The trust did what he built it to do. A document signed 14 months before the funeral with a notary's seal survived a second will and a woman's confidence and a room full of grief. And it survived because my father, who had been imperfect in loud ways his whole life, had been precise in the one way that counted. I have a rule now. I didn't choose it exactly. I think it chose me out of everything I watched happen in those months. The rule is this. Love is not a feeling that excuses someone from their choices. And the choice is not meaningful until it costs something. My father's last meaningful choice cost him a difficult conversation with a lawyer, and the knowledge that Sandra would eventually sit across from Gerald Oates and learn that she had not, in fact, known everything. That was what it cost him. He paid it. He paid it quietly and in advance, and he left me the receipt in a sealed envelope with my name in his handwriting. If you have someone in your life who keeps telling you that you deserve less and keeps arranging the evidence to prove it, know this: the arrangement is not the truth. It is a version. And versions can be revised, even late, even with paperwork, even from a parking lot appointment that was not what it was said to be. It is not too late for the right thing to be done quietly and completely, and in a way that holds. The emerald vase is still on the center bench. I use it every week. Subscribe if you know what it is to wait a long time for a door to open, and then find, when it finally does, that someone was always on the other side of it, holding it from a room you didn't know they were in. Drop a comment below. Tell me if you've ever gotten something late that still arrived exactly on time. I'll see you in the next one.